we should.
My name is Lisa Beth Lentini Walker, and I am very excited that we have a very special guest here today. I am one of the co-founders of MentorCore, and we are here to develop a compliance, security, and risk community that supports each other and talks about some of the really important topics of the day. And my co-founder, Dan.
Hi, everybody. Dan Ayala. Great to be here once again, Lisa Beth. Always a pleasure. And these are becoming, I don't know how to becoming. They've long since become just a high point of my week to be able to have some of these discussions with people from communities within security, which is today. And then I've gotten to learn so much more about the compliance world as a result of it. So thanks.
Absolutely. And there is a convergence going on. Privacy, security, compliance, risk. It's all getting cozy with each other at this point. so, so we're thrilled. This is Security Awareness Month, and we have as one of our security-focused people, Lucia here. I met her through my brother, actually, and for the first time, we actually met in person in San Francisco, what feels like a million years ago, even though it was less than a year ago. So I don't want to steal any of your thunder because you have a really amazing background. And one of our first questions for you is provide some background about you. You've got board service, you've got a legal background, you've got privacy. Like, tell us about this complete triple threat that you are.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's great to be here. And thank you both, Lisa and Dan, for having me on today. So a little bit about myself. I'm a professional learner, hence the different backgrounds that come together into what I do today. I'm originally from Romania. I started coding back when I was 12 years old. I focused on a computer science major back in high school. I moved to United States early on in my career, really not to date myself, but started out doing Y2K compliance, then sort of worked my way up through system administrator to systems engineer. I've always been a lifelong learner. I love learning on the job. I love taking on new challenges. So I sort of started playing with, specific around adaptive control, security permissions was sort of earlier on in my career. And at the same time, continuing my education. So I got my master's, my undergrad in business management. Then I did my master's in business administration while I was working full time. My goal was ultimately always to be a lawyer, was not to be a techie. It's thanks to my dad. My dad was, from early on in my life, he encouraged me to do two things, which actually really three, but learn English, learn computers, and business. Every time I told him I want to be a lawyer, he said, forget about it. This really is not that important. Just learn business and computers. And that really was, my focus earlier on, primarily because of the focus from my father. But I still wanted to be a lawyer. That was something that was near and dear to me. As I continued to move up the career ladder through the technical track, sort of, I slowly started taking on, projects and programs and start running, large integrations that really landed me my first sort of leadership role. I spent most of my career in IT infrastructure and operation, and through that career and through that IT, infrastructure, I slowly started taking more and more the role of security. I've taken on the role of governance, risk, and compliance. Which is what you and I have in common, Lisa. And I love that. I did that while I was going through law school at night. You'll see a theme here of me going through school at night for most of my adult career while working full time. And I really fell in love with speaking risk, being able to translate. And one thing that I learned about myself through this self-discovery was that I was able to translate technical language into business objectives and business terms, probably because of in my exposure to business education a little bit more than other technical folks. But really, for me, it was that getting more involved into privacy and security, there was that aha moment that this is what I want to do the rest of my life. So here I'm today. I'm the global resident chief information security officer for a company called Proofpoint. Prior to this, I was a chief information security officer and chief privacy officer for Polycom. Those of you know that triangular shaped phone in the middle of the conference room. And there was, through running GRC that it really brought me to security and privacy. And I realized that, what, I want to move away a little bit more from IT and just focus on privacy and security, because that is what makes me happy. That is what makes me fulfilled. This is what I can really bring value to really, really bring together my legal knowledge and my business knowledge and the technical into just one cohesive, role that I think that's, cybersecurity brings to the table today.
You're totally speaking Dan's language.
Yeah.
Smiling. Like I see the smiles on the inside coming out.
I'm going off script because I have a question for you. And this is this is a debate that comes up a lot in terms of what I feel is the inevitable collision of security and privacy, or the path forward together. There are those that don't think they are heading together, nor that they belong together. I'm curious I have an idea from what you just said, but I'm curious your thoughts and on why they are or are not naturally, they're going to head together or not.
So in my opinion, I think privacy and security, they're clear overlaps, right? There are parts where they two come together, but I definitely believe that securing the data does not equate to having a privacy program. And I think that's where a lot of the challenges come in. There's definitely a clear conflict of interest potentially, right? And that's something that we debated extensively in my last role in terms of, was I the right person to hold both roles, because of the clear conflict. I also happen to think there's a clear conflict of interest if the CISO reports to the CIO, right? They should be peers. If you have the same budgets, it's easier to deprioritize security, et cetera. So to me, in many ways, is no different. However, being a privacy officer, I feel like it requires a certain level of legal knowledge or ability to interpret laws, more so that many technical folks don't necessarily have the training and their understanding. There's some better than others, of course, but I do believe that you have to have some checks and balances to avoid that conflict of interest. The way that we worked around it and sort of build this, and it makes sense because I was a privacy advocate early on before we ever built a privacy program, and because of my legal background, I couldn't run with it, right? I built our privacy program from the ground up, the same way as I built the security program from the ground up. But as part of it, we built checks and balances across the board. And what, sort of to get to that point in building those, and granted, I built my security program before I built my privacy program, we created a cross-functional board, privacy and security review board, that brought in business leaders, so the C-level staff as the representative for that function, right? Let's be honest, right? IT or the privacy officer does not own the data, business does. Right. So it is absolutely their job and their due diligence to be that data champion, to be that data protector. So we build that consensus across the board in terms of every e-staff member understanding the risk around privacy and security for their organization, having technical champions, having their, second in commands to be on the hook for actual action items and things that we have to accomplish, et cetera, as well as identify data champions in every one of the functions, because they were the ones that had to ultimately, go and make sure that we safeguard the data, we document it, we know how it's used, you name it, right? So it takes a village. I know we say that all the time. But to me, it was absolutely imperative that we brought that check and balance. And I know enough about, the personal liability associated with grinding privacy and security at the same time, to where, I wanted to be able to continue leading the both sides of the spectrum, but really wanted to push for having that oversight committee that I reported into to make sure that I'm not single-handedly, making the wrong decision that's going to impact our business.
Fascinating.
That's,
And I
yeah,
know that we
great.
have a lot of the same concerns about, is there a conflict between compliance and ethics? Should compliance be reporting into legal? And I think this whole broad spectrum of risk and kind of governance activities, there are going to be a lot of questions. And frankly, I don't know that there's going to be one size that fits all in any organization. I think a lot of it comes down to the talents and skills that you have on your team.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more. And I think one of the things that we talk a lot about is the role of the CISO, right? As morphing, and we talk a lot about how is that shifting. And there are a lot of sort of expectations that the CISO's role is morphing into more of that of a CRO, the chief risk officer, right? And we'll see, right? Just like there's a lot of talks around the role of the CIO to becoming more of that, chief data officer, the chief digital transformation officer, you name it, right? There are various different things out there, but I agree with you. I think it really comes down to one, who's the grown up in the room on your e-staff? I'm sorry, but that's
Hopefully
the
you've got
reality.
more than one, but sometimes one will be enough.
Exactly. Who is that risk-minded person? Which is why I don't think, and we see the shift of the chief security officer moving away from traditional, they've been part of the CIO staff, right, part of the IT, but we're seeing that starting to move outside of the CIO reporting, whether it's the CFO, the COO, the GC, the CEO, and some extent the board and others, right? And it's sort of been all of the map, because I do firmly believe that it very much depends on your organization. Whoever has the risk hat on, whoever can speak risk and understand risk, in my opinion, that is where that role should report in the organization, to make sure that you have that adequate support to be able to bring and have those frank, honest risk discussion in terms of what is your appetite to accept that risk. Well, do we need to mitigate it? What's our response treatment period, right? Are we transferring, accepting, mitigating, etc.?
And if you take, I think that's a really great point, because if you take that and just apply that back to what's the best way to reduce risk in terms of reporting structure, who's best going to be able to support it? It may be CISO to CIO, but they may become an acceptable risk, because that's the best way to get things forward in that organization with those people.
Right. So going back to a little bit of where we started, how long have you been managing teams? And I know that your teams are pretty global, pretty virtual. So how long have you been doing the people management part of
So
your
I'll
job?
say on and off for about 12 to 15 years, give or take. Started out with just managing project teams. And then as I progressed in my career, moving into roles where I manage, manage leaders of teams and outsource service models, to now today spearheading a team of leaders. So pretty broad. It's been around for a while. There are lots of learning opportunities, throughout as you move on from very task-oriented team management to leading and inspiring your teams. And to be fair and honest, I think each one of them require a different tactic, a different way of approaching it to really get to your desired outcome and result.
So is there anything different when you're dealing with a global team, as opposed to just people who are all sitting there with you wherever you live?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start out with just talking a little bit about diversity, because I think that's absolutely key. We talked a lot about diversity, and obviously having virtual global teams bring in quite a bit of diversity, and it's important to sort of frame it. And I think a lot of people today tend to think of diversity as like simple demographic, matter, color, gender, age, you name it. However, groups can be disparate in many different ways, and diversity is also based on cultural differences, informational differences, reflecting a person's education and experience, values, goals, all of those can really influence what one perceives to be the mission of something that's as small as a single project or as large as an entire company. And really, I think now talking about moving towards looking at international diversity, drawing on the benefits of international diversity, bringing together people from many cultures, varied work experiences, and different perspective on strategic and organizational challenges help multinational companies compete in this current business environment that is extremely fast-paced. However, creating those successful work groups is hard enough, to your point, Lisa, to when everyone is local in one office and sharing the same space versus everybody being remote. And when teams come from different countries and functional background and are really working in different location, communication can rapidly deteriorate, and misunderstanding can come up from the simplest simplest communications and task assignment, etc. And that cooperation can rapidly degenerate and create a lot of distrust. There's actually an article in HBR and Harvard Business Review that I fully agree with. Is talk about the key to making global teams work is that emotional connection among team members. The article talks a lot about the level of social distances and introduced a framework specifically to how to deal with that. I think it's called SPLIT. Goes very much around structure, process, language, identity, and technology, but how each one of those affect how you collaborate in that global environment. I couldn't agree more. I think that focusing on specifically on that level of social distance, it's key, because that is, that's the magic to bringing your teams together. There's the magic of making your teams gel. And that comes the case whether you are in offices or not in an offices. I think the benefit to having a global team that goes to a regional office, you still have a certain flavor of the company culture, right? You still have, they have other peers, etc., that can come together and help each other, right? So then even though you may not necessarily be connected up to the mothership, to say, you're also you're interacting and building that camaraderie with the people in your smaller office. So you get a feel of belonging, right? Which is great. You still have to be very much culturally sensitive. And I know personally, when I moved from Romania to United States, and I had never traveled anywhere in the world outside of Romania. So there's a pretty big shock, to say the least, as moving here and not really having any other, fellow Romanians that I knew around, etc. I just kind of felt like outside on an island, right? So it's important to be sensitive to all of those cultures. Now, if you're talking about switching over to doing that virtually, that's where communication is imperative no matter what, right? Whether you're in an office, whether you're virtual, it becomes that much more compounding importance if you have a virtual team. First and foremost, if you just have people in different offices and you don't visit them regularly by virtual teams specifically, whatever you did that worked well in communicating when you're in an office, you have to work 10 times harder to do it while you're virtual, because the opportunity for misunderstanding is really high. And when you're sort of out there on an island and you don't have someone else to kind of check in with, right? You're starting to get that feel that, do I even matter? Is what I do, does what matter? Does anybody notice that I work around the clock, etc., right? And those are really legitimate questions that you have to address.
So in March, when we started down this COVID journey, teams that existed had some pre-relationship, whether they were virtual or in person. Since then, have you had to make any adjustments, or how have you made adjustments to your global teams, both to keep them in touch, but also as you're adding new members, to be able to give them some of the shared experiences they would have gotten in person, or when you visited, or when they had meals with each other, to account for some of the changes in the most recent past.
Yeah, so for me personally, I've lived in this sort of environment for a very long time. So in my prior role, I worked for a video conferencing company. It was unified communication. Video was the way of life. My teams were global. My teams were virtual. And that's really, we all know, and we talk a lot about cybersecurity having a shortage of resources and shortage of skills gap. That allowed me to get top talent around the globe to be able to, to bring them in as part of my team and be able to better secure and mature my program by having access to those global resources. So I can tell you specifics that worked for me. Obviously, communication is key. And I do have to say that managing a virtual team is a completely different bowl of wax than managing you're working in the same office. Communication, I can't underscore that enough, but it goes back to also goal setting and flexibility. So for me, I learned very early on that, and I learned from watching one of my previous leaders several jobs ago to where not to be. I never wanted to be a micromanager. And that's definitely the case when you have virtual teams, is you have to trust your team. You have to rely on the team. You have to be able to set goals, not worry about someone logging in from 8 to 5. You need to set detail, expectations. You have to set those goals. You have to communicate those goals. You have to have them regurgitate those goals to make sure that you're on the same page. But also allowing flexibility. Understand that when you're virtual, when you're working from home, they're families, they're pets, there are things that will happen, things that will come up, and which is why managing your teams from a goal setting perspective is absolutely critical to making that successful versus trying to micromanage everything um, everything you like them to, like how long you're on your computer, etc. Right? Metrics are key to how they're performing, and really understand that we're all here to do our jobs. Obviously, you're always going to have the non-performers, etc. But for the most part, most people are excited to be where they are, and to bring them together to not feel like on the island. You have to do periodic check-ins, right? You have to figure out what works for people. You have to be flexible on what works for people. I had people that they're night owls. They could not work in the morning. It's like, do you mind if I work from 12 to midnight? I'm like, knock yourself down. Like, I don't care. Here's what I expect from you, right? I had other folks that have elder parents at home and they needed to, maybe sign out at 3, but they'll get back on the computer after the kids go to bed, right? Understanding where your team is personally is it's imperative to be able to support them for whatever it is they need, because if they're not comfortable and content at home, they're not going to be able to deliver at work, right? And I used to be a believer of not mixing personal with business, and I still have a level of that. However, I realize that in today's digital world, it's impossible not to do that. We spend so much of our lives at work with the teams we build, and I've some of the most amazing leaders I work for, I'm close friends with today. Some of my team members, they're rock stars. I still check in with them periodically. It's just you become sort of an extended family, right? So understanding what everybody's going through, sharing. I used to, for a while, when I started to really grow my virtual team with my leadership team, we used to spend 5 to 10 minutes each one. They have to tell me, talk about their hobbies, talk about the latest movies. I don't care. I'll just pick a random question every single staff meeting once a week, and we had to go around and talk about something else other than work to really get to, and it was maybe a silly game, but that really got us to know each other better, what we like, what we're passionate about, what we do in our spare time, what are the causes that we want to push. One of my employees, In a previous role, she was very passionate about environmental protection, etc. And when we had, as an organization, we had an initiative to be better stewards of the environment, etc. And then we're looking for volunteers to help with that project. I immediately knew who I was going to recommend. That, like, no, can you please get her on this project? This is something she loves. And again, it goes back to getting to know your team. So when right opportunities come along, you can push them and you can encourage them and promote them into areas that otherwise they might not know about, right? And it really comes back to knowing what your team is dealing with at home, knowing what your team's aspirations are, and then just trying to encourage and foster those over time. I know those are long-winded answers.
Oh, it's
So,
great.
No, it's
a
great.
great answer. And we talk, this is great from a leadership perspective. If I could flip it around 180 degrees, we don't all have leaders or bosses or managers that think like that. Any advice or recommendations for people that may not have a boss like that as to how to introduce that discussion now that we're all in this model for, and many of us, for the foreseeable future, to introduce better remote team hygiene?
yeah, I would say that, for me is you have to read your boss, right? In terms of the openness to it. But oftentimes, I will say folks don't necessarily know that they're not doing something. It's not maybe out of, I don't care about this. It's more out of, tend to be so caught up into the day-to-day work that maybe we don't always take the time to pause and think about how can I be better, right? So bring that up, right? Bring it up with your leaders. Talk about, hey, would you be open to this? I personally am missing the interactions with the team. I would really love to know what the other peers are doing. Would you be open to this, right? So at least bring it up as a suggestion. And I'm pretty sure 9 out of 10, your bosses will say like, oh, that's a great suggestion. Let's give it a try. I don't think I've ever had, of course, you have the ones or twos, right? They're just
Right.
negative Nancy's, but that's just human life, right? You're going to have some folks that are very set on their ways, and that's fine too. But 9 out of 10 folks will be absolutely, sure, I didn't think about it. Thank you for suggesting it. One thing that I've done with my teams that I can tell you that was extremely difficult, and I have not done that in a while. I need to pick it back up. But in my last role, I used to ask my teams at least every other month, tell me one negative thing about me, about how we interact. That was hard to hear the first few times. And I can tell you it was extremely difficult for my team members to actually be honest with me because they're afraid, like, I'm not going to tell you you're terrible at something.
You care too much.
You care too. The only problem you have is that you have no problems. I had a manager who got me onto that habit at performance review time. When I was getting my performance review, the expectation was that there was 10 minutes at the end for reverse feedback. And I found that to be really helpful. I like this idea too. I love this idea now in this world is a regular.
Yeah, no, and that was definitely harsh to hear. I remember one particular, the first person that actually broke the ice and told me, you multitask way too much. I would like, and I don't know, slightly OCD, and I'm constantly like doing 20 things at one time. And she's like, look, we're having our one-on-one. I think it is disrespectful to both of our time if you're not actually looking at me when we're talking. It's like, but I'm paying attention to you. It's like, yeah, but I would like you to look at me, and I'm happy to reschedule. And it was actually one of my millennial leaders, and I took a step back. It had to take a deep breath because she was correct. And it took a lot of hard work for me to not look at my computer, especially because I typically in my office will have 2-3 monitors at once. And there's always something happening in security. That's the reality, right? That there's always some fire somewhere that you're having to deal with. So it's easy to just say, well, I got to take this, right? And I learned from there to, if I can't give that dedicated 15-minute time, then it's probably better to reschedule for when I do have it. But again, it takes a lot of self-awareness and change to be able to make that transition. And sorry,
So
Dan, I think I interrupted you. I don't know if you had anything else to
No,
say.
that was all good. Thanks.
I have some other questions for you.
Sure.
So last week we had a session on inclusion and mentoring, and some of the things that people should know about when they're dealing with different populations. Now, one of the things that I've heard repeatedly and I've seen in action is there aren't a lot of women in cyber. How do you create an environment that is more welcoming and helps foster additional inclusion when you have a long legacy of it being largely male dominated?
I think it starts out with, really getting out there and being in front of the younger generation, starting out with the high schoolers and even middle schoolers, to know that it's okay as a female to aspire to be a technologist, right? You may not necessarily know what, cybersecurity is, though nowadays I feel like kids are so much more tech savvy than maybe we used to be earlier on. But more so than that, one of the things that I've been focusing on more conscientiously in the last several years is looking at how we post jobs, looking at the environments that we do. So we tend to, unconscious, I think, to an extent, right? When we open up a job rec looking to hire someone, we put in our wish list, everything under the sun, even though we know
Looking for the
that
unicorn, right? You're looking for the
exactly,
unicorn.
even though we know that I really just need these 5 things. And sure, if someone will have the other 20, will be fantastic, right? Well, what we do, and I think it goes back to the psychology of it, and I've heard a lot of folks talk, talk about it, and I've read a lot of research on it, that women tend to be a little more self-critical of themselves in terms of like, oh, I have to check every box or I'm not good enough, right? Versus men, it's like, well, I check about 25%. I think I'm going to apply for this job, right?
So they won't apply unless they have them all, is what?
Yeah.
Women are not
don't apply
inclined to
unless
apply
they
at
have them
all.
all,
Yeah.
but guys are like, I can do it.
Yeah, even if it's like 50%.
I mean about a quarter of them.
Yeah. So for me, it was more starting to look at how I was in working with my HR partners, how I was coming across in recruiting. Because it starts out with attracting the talent, right? I think that's sort of the first step into it. And in that is really setting out the, what is expected. So trying to narrow down my job descriptions to what do I absolutely need to have, right? So put that in there. Here's what I need to have, and here's the nice to haves. And with that definitely has increased the pool of female candidates. Around, starting to apply, etc. So that's the one. But then 2, once you do attract, that talent, is making sure that you hold your entire team at the same level of expectations, right? It's and you need to actually think through what are the typical ramification, etc. If you're going to allow the entire team to be flexible, then obviously females tend to be a little more nurturing, though there are plenty of men out there, they're like single dads and raising kids, etc. So it's having to have those policies, they're flexible to your individual needs, whether you are a dad that in charge of the kids, or single dad or mom that has to take the kids to school and after school activities, and allowing them to do what they need to do at home. It's critical versus like, no, everybody must work till 8 p.m. Sorry, I don't care if you have a family at home, right? And guess what, a lot of men were able to rely on their spouses to make that happen, but not vice versa, right? So it's attracting the women into the space, but also providing that environment for them to thrive, and understand that security has so many different aspects to it, right? And if you're earlier on in your career and you have the flexibility to work long hours, you may love to be in incident response, deal with cyber incidents, etc. Right? That's thrilling and exciting, and a lot of us
Lots of hours.
Exactly.
Lots
A lot
of
of
hours.
us in security are typically adrenaline junkies of some kind, and that's why we're there. So earlier in your career, that may be okay, but as you move on through that family journey, then maybe GRC is a better time, right? Because you don't have the around the clock 24/7.
There's no 2
Right?
a.m. policy emergency.
Exactly, right?
What?
And you can do your risk assessments and a regular business hours, right? But that's the beauty of trying, if your goal is to striving to become a security leader, there's so many areas of security that allow you to move throughout your career and learn from each one of them, right? To get you to build that well-rounded experience to becoming a security leader, while also raising a family and enjoying your hobbies and your passions and etc.
I think the point you make is so important, because there is not one way to be involved in information security or in compliance or in privacy, right? There are lots of different paths. And part of what we're hoping to do is just raise awareness that it's not like there's only one type of job out there if you're interested in tech, or if you like the law, or if you like ethics or privacy. So I think that's really valuable. And it's important to know that different periods in your life might have you doing different things in your career just because of what your priorities are. And that's okay. That's actually a really great outcome.
Have you felt, or have you seen any forward progress on people being more compassionate about flexibility now? Virtual teams, like you said earlier, have always been about getting to know people at a more human level. Now that more people that haven't always been on virtual teams are now doing so and getting to know people at a more human level, is this becoming a little, do you see things softening? Softening in a good way?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do. I think that so absolutely. When I worked in just specifically on video conferencing technology, et cetera, that was not necessarily the norm across the board, right? Video conferencing technology in the past definitely tend to be more expensive, heavy infrastructure, you name it, right? And there was just this sort of hesitation. You had the technology companies and really the big global companies that embrace video conferencing because of cost of travel, et cetera, and for like team building. But you had a lot of traditional organizations that require people to still be in an office in an 8 to 5 environment. And, video conferencing was not something that they were accustomed to. You have the very traditional, worlds, they're forced to embrace this, right? So it's sort of, we're all, we kind of all went through this, being at home with the kids and the pets and the spouses all into one space. And we all became compassionate about each other's experience and where we are, because we knew how we felt, so we know that everybody else has to deal with the same challenges. And I definitely have seen that rigor shift. It used to be to where, several years ago, or really even last year before COVID, right? When you're on video for a video conferencing, everybody would have to be, it's just very much like suit heavy and just trying to bring that, office into the video world. And worse, which is most people would just not turn on their cameras. I still get to a lot, not quite as many, but I used to get into a lot of calls after leaving video conferencing world, and be the only person on video because I lived it for 7-8 years. So to me, it was like, no, that's something to be said about looking someone in the eye, even if it's the virtual eye, right? By seeing the facial expressions and the body language to know you're actually paying attention. I still demanded of my teams that they are on video. When we have team meetings, I need everyone on video. Unless you're sick, that's fine, right? We don't necessarily need to have you on video for that, but I want to make sure that, we're all engaged. If that time is 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30, I don't care the length of time. I want quality, not quantity, right? It's there to get in, talk, get stuff done, and move on, right? So long story short, there's definitely a lot of softening. There's definitely tolerance around, hearing the dog barking that we see across the board, or the kid coming in, et cetera. I was actually speaking at a women's security leaders event a couple of weeks ago, and it was kind of a late night, et cetera. And my son was getting ready to leave, and I wasn't going to see him for a week. And I sort of just, I took a double take because I'm like, I'm not going to see him. I want to give him a hug, but I'm in the middle of talking. And I just made the decision, split moment. I'm like, you know what? I have to say goodbye to my kid. So I said, I'm sorry. I apologize. I need 2 seconds. I got to say goodbye to my kid and get back on it, because that's the reality of the world we live in, right? So, and I think that there's definitely a bit more acceptance. There's still folks that too concerned, how do I look on video? And I will have to say that my first several months working on for a video conferencing company and being on video all the time was a little different in terms of I didn't want to look at myself every time. Every time I got on video, I'm like, oh my God, really, I don't want to see myself. But really, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how your hair looks. It doesn't matter if, you know, whatever. It's really there for the engagement and the value that the seeing each other's body language brings to the table and to the conversation, and making sure that you are not checked out. And I think it's critical.
And that leads to one of my questions, and at least I'm going to let you, only because it follows on so perfectly, if you don't mind.
Perfect.
One of the large things, especially in security, is leading through influence. And without video, remote teams don't always have the luxury of video. I think we're moving into that, as you've mentioned. But how to build that influence when a lot of it is through how people see you, interact with others, even when it's not a direct. How do I see him interacting with that person in the hallway? All that helps to build influence. How have you been able to build influence, I guess, without video or with video in a remote team, and encourage people to do the same?
So I will say that there are multi dimensions to that. The first, it comes in more from a business angle perspective. The second is more from a personality perspective. The business angle perspective, and I think that one of the mistakes that we tend to make as security leaders is talk a lot about us and our teams and how amazing our teams are and how much phishing emails we caught and all the technical jibber jabber that honestly most staff members don't care about. So I think the business aspect of it is understanding the business objectives for that leader, right? Who, what are they trying to accomplish? What is their goal, right? And then our job is to make sure that we understand them, we stay connected with them, and really talk about how do we enable them to accomplish those goals securely, right? How do we protect the revenue associated with those business goals versus my job is to just secure, I don't care about the revenue, right? Because the reality is we do, right? Our job as security leaders, and so is that of IT leaders, is there to protect the organization and provide the infrastructure necessary to conduct business. The ultimate goal is whatever the business objectives are. So spend the time with your leaders in the organization to understand their goals and their missions, their objectives, and how you can help them achieve it, right? So that's one. People part of it comes from one, having that one-on-one interaction with them, but then find out who are their most trusted advisors in that organization, and make sure that you forge relationships with their trusted advisors as well, because guess what? They may believe you and listen to you, but when they're going to ask their trusted advisors, like, hey, what are your thoughts about our new security leader? Or what are your thoughts about XYZ, right? Everybody speaks the same language. You had already vetoed that message with the lieutenants of whoever you're trying to make sure that you're able to influence across the board. So, as I said, it comes back to soft skills and slightly business skills and bringing them together in order to be able to influence. And I think that's the beauty of my job that I love. It's very much focusing strategically how to impact, because let's face it, cybersecurity is a complex topic. It's a topic that for many people, it's hard to grasp. We all know that it's important. For example, board of directors, and Lisa, you mentioned my involvement in advisory boards, a board of directors, and I spend a lot of time working on how to build better understanding of boards around cybersecurity. But it goes back to a lot of them say, look, I get it, security is important, but I have no idea what my CISO told me, because it's so technically heavy and is not related back to the business objectives and the business mission and how do you mitigate and reduce the risk to those objectives and the revenue based on whatever initiatives you've taken. So it's spending that time to translate it into something that's meaningful. And I think that that's probably the most difficult part of the CISO's job, right? We all know technical pieces. We can figure those out. It's everything else. And the other thing I was going to mention too is around those lines is, we always talk about the four faces of a CISO or the four roles of a CISO, which goes through that of, technician and governance, more for like guiding data, strategic and advisor. I think there was a study done by Deloitte a while back around this, and based on the respondents on the surveys, look like most CISOs are they're more aspiring into the strategic and advisory pieces, but they're more around being the stewards of the data and the technical face of the room. And we really need to be able to elevate that conversation to that strategic advisory level to really get to the same level with the C-level staff and the boards.
And that brings it back around. Oh, sorry. Go
yes.
ahead. No,
so
go, Lisa. Go.
Really quickly, and I know that Dan's got our signature question waiting for you at the end, but you talked very briefly about your board service. How did you find the boards that you're sitting on? And how is that part of kind of like your career journey? Because I know a lot of our members want to get involved with either professional association boards or private company boards or public company boards. What's your story?
So for me, I've sort of fell into my first advisory board role. I was more so recruited than I looked for one. I've always aspired towards making an impact, and I think it's really just from a lot of my work around how do we as an industry get better aligned to boards, because boards know that security is important. We want to tell the story, but somehow we get lost in translation somewhere in the middle. So through that, my first advisory board was for a university and just really helping them. It was University of Colorado, Denver, and just trying to help them, working with a number of other CISOs as well, in building a cybersecurity master's program. And that was sort of opening the door to a couple of other advisory board members, advisory board roles. One of them specifically was really, I used to work and dotted line report to one of the executives in a previous role as running, product security. And as he moved on to a new startup as another C-level executive role, he asked if I would be willing and open to advising, which obviously I really very much enjoyed my time working, with him previously. So I was more than happy to do so. So I really started out the first one through the word of mouth. I will say that a lot of other CISOs, based on what I hear from them, start out with joining customer advisory boards. That's sort of an easier way to start dipping your toes into that world. There are a number of educational programs out there around learning about what it means to be a corporate director, talking about the fiduciary duty, your duty of care around being a board member. There's a personal liability associated with it. So, my advice would be if boards are of interest to you, right? Think about, do you want that personal liability associated with the board role, with the board of directors role for for-profit company versus advisory board opportunity, which does not necessarily have a personal liability associated with it. It's more around you advising, become as a strategic advisor to their strategy. So weigh the pros and cons of both. And I will definitely highly encourage to start out with those customer advisory boards, because those are typically a little bit easier way to start dipping your toes in before really progressing, and see if that's, do you have the time to really do so, etc.
Great. And I know we're running out of time, so Dan,
we'll close. We always close all of our sessions with a consistent question, and because we're so focused on mentoring, I'd love to know what the best advice you've ever received from a mentor is.
Oof. It's tough because I think for me, I've been fortunate in my career to have several amazing mentors, and I've learned something precious from each one of them. And I feel like each advice was a connecting dot to the next, which brought me to where I am today. I would say for earlier in the career, my very first mentor encouraged me to find where my passion lied and follow and follow that. She really recommended a number of books, but they're all around, I don't remember exactly the title, but they all around my self-reflection process. And I didn't know it at the time, but going through that self-reflection process helped me become a better leader when I did find what I was passionate about. And once I got there, I knew I was in the right place. So that was definitely very critical for me as I was trying to find what do I want to be when I grow up, right? I knew I want to be a lawyer. I love tech. Is there something that can bring it all together? I didn't realize the security and privacy was it. But I'm definitely happy that I found it and I'm where I am today. Now, another mentor has really helped me through executive engagement and business alignment, teaching me the value, which is what we talked about a little bit earlier, about the value of spending time with each leader individually and their reports to understand their business, their goals, and how I can help them achieve that. That was absolutely invaluable, and that helped me really move my program across from a very small security program to a fairly robust, mature program across the board. And that was truly by influencing and spending time with them. And lastly, one of my other mentors that it's a huge role model of mine, and I think all of those three are equally important. He always pushed me beyond my limits. He always pushed me where he saw potential. He encouraged me to like, hey, I really think you should look this. Obviously, it was always my choice, but he saw a natural ability that I had and constantly encouraged me to take on something outside of my comfort zone. And that was the best advice that I've ever given. Obviously, when you have your mentor that becomes sponsor and he's the one that's pushing you, it's even better, right? Because now you have this opportunity in front. So it's not only being mentored to do it, but it's having the help to be able to get those opportunities. But I've always raised my hand. But since his advice, even if I'm not comfortable with a particular role, but I have a lot of interest in it, I'll raise my hands and I learn not to be afraid to fail. I know a lot of learning comes from failing. None of us are born knowing everything, right? We learn through our experiences, and sometimes some of the best lessons are the ones we learn when we fail.
I wish I could tell that to my 12-year-old self.
I tried telling it to my 12-year-old and she doesn't listen too much. So
does
I don't
mine.
know that it would make a difference.
Lucia, thank you so much. Really appreciate all of your time and insights. Just fabulous advice, fabulous insights, and I'm so glad to have had you here. Thank you so much for being here. And hopefully we'll have a chance to chat again soon. You've sparked a whole bunch of additional questions about leadership and remote teams and security, and I would love to continue the conversation perhaps another time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed the talk.
Very good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.